This is the, you know, Jim Crow of our time. This is the Holocaust of our time. This is the South African apartheid of our time. And so when I have the skills of being a trained family doctor, when I understand the structural determinants of health, including that of colonialism, from that framing of being a public health scholar, then it's an obligation to do everything within my power to help the people of Gaza.
Welcome to another episode of Yalla, Let's Talk. From Columbia University to the University of Ottawa, we're seeing academic institutions silencing people. Today, we'll be talking about silencing pro-Palestinian voices, the implications, what you can do, as well as what it's like visiting Rahaf in Gaza right now. We are honored to have Dr. Yipeng Ge. Dr. Yipeng Ge is a Chinese-Canadian, first-generation immigrant and family doctor. After advocating for Palestine, Dr. Yipeng Ge found himself suspended from the University of Ottawa without warning or due process. Though the University of Ottawa decided to reinstate Dr. Yipeng, he ultimately decided to not go back. Instead, he went to Gaza, specifically the border in Rahaf, to help people in Gaza with medical services. Thank you so much for coming to Yalla, Let's Talk. I wanted to start off by saying thank you for everything that you're doing and for what you stand for. And it truly is an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. The honor is mine to be here.
Thank you. So, Dr. Yipeng, I want to dive right into the first question, which is the suspension. Can you walk us through the day you found out you were suspended from the University of Ottawa?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I remember it quite vividly because I got a phone call at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday to tell me that I was suspended indefinitely without so much as the social media post in question. And the person that called me was someone who wasn't even involved in that conversation that happened on the Saturday before. And it was only until 2 weeks later did I get the evidence, the social media post in question, that I was being accused of being unprofessional, sharing inflammatory or anti-Semitic content, which in of itself is false, but also racist and discriminatory to frame all these social media posts that were flagged for standing for health and human rights for Palestine and Palestinians. To frame that as anti-Semitic or as unprofessional in of itself is racist and discriminatory.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to just dive into the post itself. What was the post in question that they deemed to be quote unquote anti-Semitic that got you to be suspended?
It was a huge, long list of screenshots of social media posts, mostly on Twitter, that went as far back as like 2 years, I think, related to Palestine. There were social media posts, most of which were just reposts, many of which were not even in my own words. Things from MSF, from the UN, from UNICEF, from Jewish Voice for Peace, independent Jewish voices in Canada, really calling out the racist double standards of the response to what was happening in Palestine and Gaza as it amounted to an ongoing genocide, and flagging the flagrant abuse of human rights in Palestinian territories for now 76 years in the framing of Zionist settler colonialism and the framing of an ongoing Nakba.
And that makes sense. A lot of times we're posting, we're advocating, we're standing up for human rights and injustices, which you would assume that academic institutions would be all for. But then they misconstrue our posts, our social media advocacy to make it something that it's not. And I think a lot of people who are listening will relate to this because we do see that it has been an epidemic where so many people are posting something, and then whether they're employees or whether they're students, they're coming into the office and they're like, this is what you posted, this is what it means, without even having room to explain or have a discourse or nuanced conversations. So You then were reinstated at the University of Ottawa. Can you walk us through them reinstating you and why you chose not to go back?
I mean, they went through their own uh, professionalism subcommittee investigation process, which found that through their own investigation that the social media posts in question were not anti-Semitic, were not hateful, were not unprofessional. It's actually from the exact framing of my like work and scholarship and experience in understanding colonialism as a structural determinant of health from the framing of a public health professional and training that I understand the issue of Palestine for what it is. And it was honestly through educating people within the Faculty of Medicine that to call things out as unprofessional or anti Semitic or hateful for that matter, when it's rightful speech, standing in for health and human rights for Palestine, that in of itself is discriminatory and racist. And so we've had some really frank conversations about that. And ultimately, through their own process of investigating me for professionalism, for breach of social media policy, they didn't have any leg to stand on. It didn't stand the test of time because there was nothing there that was unprofessional, hateful, anti Semitic. And those are things that I also stand against. And so they welcomed me back without so much as a apology or remorse about their own hateful and racist behavior, and actually expected me to take on all this service work for the university, to take on the role of the program that I was in, to take on the role of lead resident or chief resident, to assist with and lead the accreditation for the program from the residency point of view. And to take on these service roles, I was getting texts about taking these roles on even before I was reinstated, assuming that once this all goes away, that I would come back and toe the party line of supporting this institution that has only taken so much of my time for the past 8 years, benefited from my own scholarship. They've written multiple articles about me and my work in Indigenous health and health equity and social determinants of health, only to not even recognize their own blatant anti-Palestinian racism that they continue to perpetuate and uphold in many other cases as well, which they haven't apologized for or shown any remorse for. I had to reach out to the dean of medicine, to the senior vice dean, to have conversations as to, are we going to talk about what happened to me, like your own abuse of institutional power that led to this decision?
Abuse of institutional power. That's a very good way of framing it because you do see it. You were suspended without any investigation, without them even having a conversation with you, without them even actually examining what the posts were. So it is an abuse of institutional power. And that actually is going to bring me to the next topic, which is we're seeing all these academic institutions really not stand for what they say they stand for. We saw recently in Columbia University what had happened where all these peaceful protests were shut down and people were arrested. I believe it was over 103 people that were arrested for peaceful protests. And what people don't necessarily know is that this was a designated area where people can protest. My question to you, Dr. Yiping, is why do you think academic institutions have failed us?
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of why they continue to perpetuate racism and harm and discrimination and not support their learners. From what I've seen and heard through many conversations, and from my own experience, I see people that honestly do not have a backbone. There are certainly people who have very strong Zionist viewpoints that continue to want to silence anything related to Palestine because the cracks of Zionism as the material manifestations of Zionism is an ongoing genocide in Gaza and settler violence in the West Bank. um, when these things are so widely apparent and the cracks are so wide now, I think the attacks and reprisals are so strong because people are waking up. Like many more people are waking up. But what I've seen from some of these hospital and university administrators is that they're not actually of that viewpoint. They just don't have a backbone. They are caving to the loudest voices that they think are the most powerful voices, maybe appeasing donors, maybe appeasing people that are maybe a little bit more organized than people that are defending health and human rights for Palestine. And they are using these heavy-handed techniques, such as suspensions, actually like terminations of contracts, people being fired from their jobs, students facing expulsion from medical schools. And they're using these heavy-handed techniques to silence anyone, let alone, you know, any allies that dare speak the word ceasefire or genocide or apartheid or occupation. The number of things that seem to be off limits is just growing, right? And I see these these university administrators make their own assessment as to what to do in these circumstances when they get complaints. And they're very much for protecting their own institutional power, protecting their own roles and positions for how they've gotten where they've gotten. And you only progress within these institutions more or less with upholding the status quo. And we see that these institutions very much operate from a position of structural oppression, racism, colonialism, white supremacy. And we know that communities, specifically racialized and marginalized communities, have been sounding the alarms about these harmful institutions, you know, academic institutions that take from marginalized communities, extract research and benefit as an institution. We've known this for years, for decades. But Palestine is making it so exceptionally clear that this is what they're doing right now in this moment as an ongoing genocide is unfolding.
The past few months has really shown how much or to what extent silencing pro-Palestinian speech could look like, and it does look like. At the same time, I just remember this quote. It said, "They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds." And I think this quote just resonates so much to what's currently happening right now, because as much as they're trying to bury the truth, it just keeps growing and growing, and more people are becoming aware of what is happening in Palestine, but also around the world. And when we say free Palestine, we say free Congo, we say, you know, free Hawaii, the list goes on, Yemen, Sudan, the list can go on and on. And what I find so inspiring about your story is that you decided not to actually go back. You're like, you know what, this institution does not deserve my labor, and I am going to go and give it to people who actually will need it. And you went to Gaza, you went to Rafah to help people in Gaza with your medical services. I want to talk to you more about that experience. And first and foremost, how was it like going to Gaza and the Rafah border?
I thank you for asking, because I think we all need to continue to center the people of Palestine, the people of Gaza that are experiencing an ongoing genocide. This is what millions, if not billions in the world, have put their time and energy towards, to draw attention to the root causes of disease and suffering in Gaza and Palestine, that of structural oppression, apartheid, occupation, now manifesting itself as an ongoing genocide. And the things that have happened, like at the university, for example, are mere distractions from talking about that. And I've wanted to continue to center the people of Palestine, and it made a lot of sense over the coming weeks and months after that suspension, that is just what I needed to do, because it's an obligation to do everything that we can during an ongoing genocide to either stop it or support the people that are experiencing the unimaginable horrors of genocide. And so I had the opportunity to work out of 2 primary care clinics in Rafah, as well as visit multiple hospitals, including the European Gaza hospital in Khan Yunis in mid-February. And the patients that I treated, the patients that I saw, had multiple infectious diseases, including respiratory and gastrointestinal infections. Many of the patients that I saw were children. And I had already seen the tip of the iceberg with respect to the forced starvation that children were suffering from, the severe malnutrition, with children that I met that I was worried about them even making it to the next day. And the clinics that I worked out of didn't even have things like antibiotics. We brought a supply of a lot of things and started to prescribe them. But ultimately what my patients needed, what everyone needed, was clean water, nutritious food, and decent shelter, all of which is impossible to come by when the trucks at the land borders are being systematically withheld and arbitrarily inspected, with some of them, entering with partial goods, with some of them not even being able to enter and just throwing out their expired goods on the other side of the Rafah border. And when we see our complicit government here in Canada do performative acts like airdrop aid, which has killed people, which has landed on and killed people, and landed in the ocean, and people have drowned trying to get food aid for their families after surviving 6 months of genocide.
You mentioned a lot of excellent points. First, the patients you were seeing, a lot of them were children. And I think a lot of people forget that the biggest victim of these atrocities are children. And it's very unfortunate to see that there are injuries, but at the same time, there's so many infections. And you were saying that there's a lot of starvation and they don't even have basic necessities like clean water. And what then you mentioned was our government and it's the role that it's playing and how it's been complicit on this genocide. At the same time, when they thought they were trying to help, it actually made things worse when they were airdropping that aid. And so I wanted to go and dive more into just your experience with those patients. I know a lot of people would be wondering, what were the conversations like when you were seeing those patients?
I mean, they were both beautiful, but also complicated and so hard to bear the weight of it, because many of my patients and many of said patients with their family members, and sometimes it would be a community member because they're the only surviving child of a whole family because the rest of the family has been killed in an airstrike. But those conversations were beautiful because they were, many were just so excited to see a foreign doctor. Many were excited to know that they're like the international community stands in solidarity with them, and that we're doing what we can as humanitarian health workers to bring in medications and supplies, and just seeing and bearing witness to an ongoing genocide. Like, not only infectious diseases did I see in these young children, many of these children being like between the ages of like 2 and like 6 was probably like the majority of patients that I saw, like young
2 to 6,
pediatric
wow.
patients. And I saw, a patient that was a little bit older, age 9 to 10, was carried in by his mom because he was no longer walking because of how like malnourished he was. And I could wrap my entire index finger and thumb around the upper arm of this child and the lower leg of this child, because we were told by the World Health Organization to measure upper arm circumference. We didn't have measuring tape as well, for that matter. But I didn't need measuring tape to know that this child was severely malnourished
Wow.
and starving. And when you're already starving, this is, you're at the brink of death. But to have an infectious disease, and this child had a gastrointestinal infection, so had been throwing up for 4 days and not taking much food by mouth, you actually need to get a patient like this hospitalized to like monitor them for refeeding syndrome. You actually have to safely start to refeed them, but there's no such resource. I talked to the local doctor to get this child hospitalized, but they said that's impossible. There's no hospital for this child to go to, and all we could offer them in that clinic was IV fluid, right, which actually introduces another possible source of infection by poking the arm for venous access for a vein to get this basically sugar water in. And these conditions are just horrendous, that children are being starved to the point where they need IV fluid. And that's really all that they can get. I saw things that I never would have imagined I would ever see in my medical career, like suspected rickets disease, which is severe vitamin D deficiency to the point where children's bones are not developing properly. So let alone seeing children that were walking and now no longer walking because of severe malnutrition. I also saw patients that were between the ages of 12 months and 14 months. So these are children that should be walking and they're not walking because of severe malnutrition as well. I know we talk a lot about this war on Palestine, this genocide, as disproportionately affecting children. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge that the people that are made most structurally vulnerable include children, include people who are pregnant, yes, but they also include people with chronic diseases, right? People with invisible and visible physical disabilities, people with cancer, older adults. And I think some of these populations that are made structurally vulnerable by any existing system that has, withheld food and humanitarian aid for 17 years because of the blockade on the Gaza Strip, and limiting the caloric intakes of the entire population, which is now known as this colloquial, Gaza diet. Their health and well-being becomes impossible when civil infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure is systematically targeted and destroyed. Right now, there's no possible way to meaningfully treat cancer or diagnose cancer. And severe mental health is going so undertreated, where I spoke to a psychiatrist and a pharmacist at the clinic that I worked at, and many patients with severe psychiatric illness like schizophrenia are in psychosis because they haven't had their antipsychotic medications at that point when I was there in February for
Wow.
4 or 5 months.
Not only are people being bombed, not only are people being like killed, and there's a lot of these injuries, but we're also seeing essentially people who are malnourished, infectious diseases, people who might be susceptible to other diseases, or people who are currently experiencing other chronic diseases. And on top of that, there's a lot of still mental illnesses and issues that cannot even be treated. And yet, we see our academic institutions still trying to silence our advocacy, trying to silence our voices because of God knows what. And I think you actually put it very nicely, is that they do not have a backbone. And I think this is from an institutional perspective. I hope that what Palestine can at least do is challenge the status quo and challenge how these institutions are made up. I want to ask something very specific to you. I think a lot of people are looking at you and first admiring what you've done, because it does take a lot of courage. And it goes back to the saying that not all heroes wear capes. I want to just ask, were you not scared to go to Gaza?
Of course I was scared. I mean, I'm human. We're all human. And, but it became really clear to me over time that it's an obligation to work for the people of Gaza, to stand in solidarity with the people of Gaza as they experience an ongoing genocide. This is the, you know, Jim Crow of our time. This is the Holocaust of our time. This is the South African apartheid of our time. And so when I have the skills of being a trained family doctor, when I understand the structural determinants of health, including that of colonialism, from that framing of being a public health scholar, then it's an obligation to do everything within my power to help the people of Gaza.
Thank you. Thank you again for everything you're doing and everything you stand for. And my follow-up question to that is, would you go back to Gaza
Of course,
in a heartbeat, eh?
of course. I many people have said this, and I will say the same. I think when you go to Gaza and you come back and you have the privilege of leaving and coming back, so many are stuck at the border and unable to actually leave. For those that want to leave, which is a horrific, conclusion to come to when this is their home. I and many others have left our hearts there in Gaza. And so, of course, I will go back.
Left your heart in Gaza. Very beautiful. And again, thank you so much for everything you're doing and for everything you stand for. And I can't keep reiterating that enough. And what I find so inspiring about your story is that you went from being silenced and with the University of Ottawa, with an academic institution, but they didn't actually silence you. You took that and you basically used it to fuel your advocacy and actually help the people of Gaza. And I feel like a lot of people who are listening may be in a situation that is somewhat similar. Maybe they were terminated, maybe they were suspended, they were expelled. There was some sort of repercussion to their advocacy. What advice do you have to those who have faced repercussions for advocating for Palestine?
I mean, when you stand in solidarity with an issue or a cause that challenges the status quo, something that challenges these systems of structural racism, white supremacy, colonialism, of course you're going to get backlash. Of course you're going to have people that will vehemently try to question your character and integrity and call into question your actions and make you feel incredibly gaslit. But when we are grounded in what we know to be true and right, and when we know ourselves and we know that the community that support us and care about us are there for us, and we center those issues, when we center our community, I think nothing can really take us down, because they can try to. We see it with what's happening at Columbia University. We're seeing it, at the University of Southern California with their valedictorian Asna. We're seeing all these examples where the anti-Palestinian racism that occurs and happens, which is bound to happen because these systems of oppression do not exist because of any good reason other than people trying to uphold their institutional power, uphold the status quo. And so we need to be able to recognize that it's going to happen, but we're actually stronger for it when we tackle it head on. And we can also see it as an opportunity to highlight these institutions for what they really are. What communities have been told, what people have been telling us for generations, specifically, Black and Brown communities, that these institutions were actually there to suppress and marginalize certain communities and dehumanize certain communities.
Very well said. I do hope, again, that it does wake a lot of people up to seeing how there are these systematic barriers and what these institutions are founded on and based on. And I want to just, again, thank you so much for coming in today and discussing your experiences of being silenced by an academic institution, and again, sharing your experiences on visiting Gaza and providing your own services and your own labor to help the people of Palestine. So thank you very much. I want to just end and conclude with one last question. And the question I have for you is, what does a free Palestine look like for you?
I think that's quite simple, actually, when we think about what kind of human rights are being systematically withheld to the people of Palestine in the West Bank, in historic Palestine, in the Gaza Strip. The rest of the world, in terms of Palestinian diaspora who are exiled, born as refugees, do not have the right to return. It's those inherent human rights that need to be respected, including self-determination and the ability to live on their traditional homelands without discrimination, without occupation, without policies and practices that uphold a system of apartheid. It's true equality. And these are decent, basic human rights that are inherent to anyone in this world, but we see are not granted for Palestinians, for other, Black and brown communities around the world. My context has been understanding settler colonialism as a structural determinant of health in the context of so-called Canada as a settler colonial state. And it was from the experience of bearing witness to the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada and hearing from residential school survivors through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and their 94 calls to action as to how to move forward for a more just, equitable society in health and all these other sectors for Indigenous peoples in Canada. But here is an opportunity to stop an ongoing genocide while it's happening.
An opportunity to stop an ongoing genocide for what is happening. Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Yiping, for coming again to Yalla Let's Talk and sharing your story. And I really do think a lot of the people who are listening are going to listen to your story and feel, one, inspired, and at the same time, hopefully they'll feel that sense of hope that the more we do speak up and the more we do advocate for justice and human rights, the stronger we can all become as a community and as a global society. On that note, I would like to just remind the viewers, please subscribe to Yalla Let's Talk. And you can also follow Dr. Yiping. Dr. Yiping, what are your handles?
So on Instagram, it's yipeng.g, and on Twitter, it's just my name, Yipeng Ge.
Amazing. So don't forget to follow Dr. Yipeng Ge. And on that note, Yalla, bye.